Okay, good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
As per our normal plan, we don't have a plan, or at least you don't know what the plan is. I surprise you with questions and we have a conversation. Is that correct? Do you have any idea what we're talking about?
No, beyond getting the memo that we're both supposed to wear white T-shirts.
Yeah, sorry about that. For the folks that just listen on Spotify,
Yeah.
yes, we're both wearing just like standard white T-shirts. It's kind of embarrassing. Okay, yes, thanks for pointing that out, Professor. But other than that, you don't really know what we're talking about.
No idea.
So my assumption is that there's probably been books written on this topic, and they're not necessarily history books. They're probably like anthropology books or sociology books or contemporary books. I'm not sure, but my guess is there's books on them. Maybe I've even read one in the past. The big broad question I have for you today, or the kind of the framework of where I'm going to ask some questions, is do people, men and women, make history? Do they guide history and change history and all of a sudden we're in a whole new world because of a single man or woman or maybe a small combination of men and women, or do they react to the culture? Does the change of the time make the man or the woman? Do they, and which is more important? And so when we study history or when we're trying to think about contemporary politics today, you don't usually do this, but I'll give you the result at my question at the beginning rather than the end. What are we as citizens supposed to do? Can we actually change history as individuals, or to know we're just kind of in this sea and we're participants in the history? So that's the kind of big context. And so, the Rosa Parks thing, would it have happened anyway without Rosa Parks, or no, maybe no one else would have gone to the front of the bus? So that's a rhetorical for now. Let's go back in history. Let me ask a big question. 22% of Americans, according to some weird poll that I read, and maybe it's legitimate and maybe it's not even a weird poll, said that they actually wish we weren't a country. Or like 78% are glad that we had a revolution against England. But that says 22%. Well, I don't know. We probably shouldn't have done that. My mom may have been one of those. She's a real Anglophile. So the question is would we have been a country without George Washington, or take two or three other main leaders of that time? And if a Ben Franklin or, hadn't been there, would we have been a country? Or yes, it was inevitable. It would have happened anyway. So let's go way back and tell me man or culture or people. What's your thought?
Well, history is made by human beings. So it is the story of human beings. And story is probably the most, we're going to keep coming back to this. And I prefer the word story over the fancy word that people use, which is narrative. Mm-hmm. But I like just saying story. And history is stories we tell ourselves. And thus, everything in history is the result of how we understand our own lives and past. So in essence, even your identity, right? Who are you, John Brackney, right? Mm-hmm. That's a story that you tell yourself about yourself. And history is nothing more than the attempt to find something instructive about that. And my favorite book about it is a book by he always went by Craig in real life, but
what is it again?
Well, the title of the book is called The Degradation of American History, and the name of the historian, if you're looking up the book, is David Harlan, but his real first name was Craig, or I'm sorry, his real first name was David, but he always went by Craig. So if I call him Craig Harlan, that's because I knew him, but the book is under David Harlan, Harlan, and it's called the Degradation of American History. And maybe the most influential chapter in that book for me was called Love and Obligation. And that is that he wrote, why we engage in, there's so many evocative images in this book. I absolutely loved it. But he said, historians are like hunting dogs. We keep our nose close to the ground. And then he quotes Martin Luther King Jr. and says, there is a sense in which we are always in the red to the past, meaning we're always in debt. And thus, the really good reason to study history is out of a sense of love and obligation, because those are the motivating factors for human beings. And the best histories will be the ones that are based on your loves and your obligation, what you feel an obligation to because of what you love.
So, Professor, remember your thought. You got where you were going to go?
Yeah. So
well, let me interrupt for a second. Let me interrupt. I thought, based off a lot of interviews with you over the last couple of years, that most of history was not over love and obligation. That's BS. That's maybe a new thought, maybe a Renaissance thought, or maybe that's not Renaissance. I don't know. An American experiment thought, or English. I thought most of history was just power and family control. What is this love and obligation thing?
Well, that might be what the historian finds as the story of what happened, because sometimes power and violence are the motivating factors that the historian finds. So I'm speaking more about what should motivate the historian to write.
Okay.
But once the historian begins investigating the past, they're going to find many different factors that motivate human beings. And some of these might be impersonal factors. Some of it might be materialism. It might be the environment. It might be,
grudges.
Yeah, and it could be military, diplomatic, social. It could be cultural. It could be political. But the reasons and the motivations are infinite for what motivates a human being. You can't ever know. And the example I always give to my students is try to think about the simplest feeling you have towards any one person. Like you love your mother, for instance. Try to explain that in all of its complexity and capture everything about your relationship to your mother, right? And it's even the thing that might seem the simplest in terms of its motivation. Once you begin trying to explain it, you find that there are layers upon layers of complexity to it. You'll say, well, there was an economic motive, there was a social motive, there was a cultural motive. There probably was a time when you obeyed your mom because you were in public, or you did something, you didn't dance with your mom at a wedding because you would be embarrassed in front of your friends. So once you begin scratching that lottery ticket, you're going to find an infinite number of motivations, even in what you might consider your simplest relationship.
Fascinating. Well, so go back. I don't think you answered my question on whether we're motivated by love or power or love of family.
Well, the answer is yes.
Okay, fair enough. Okay,
right.
Maybe you'd answer it.
And even in your question about the role of human beings in history, there is one of the most important concepts to understand is the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition, meaning that the role of human beings, the role that a human plays in this drama is a necessary but not sufficient condition. We say that the role of Gandhi in India was absolutely essential and necessary. But if Gandhi had been in Stalin's Russia or in Hitler's Germany, they would have murdered him. So it's not simply enough to say that Gandhi on his own would have been a success in all times, in all circumstances, because you had to be protesting against a British government that had a free press and a parliament with an opposition that could rally supporters, and there are a lot of other conditions. You had to have a system of morality that he was comparing his series of injustices to, the cultural context of India. I don't know that. Right. I mean, it's kind of endless, but he was necessary. You cannot remove the role of the individual from the drama.
Well,
but
so
it's not sufficient.
I've seen the movie and I actually think I read that book too, but that's it. That's all I know about Gandhi. And I'm impressed with the movie and the book. It was a long movie though, and I still liked it. But I'm a little more familiar with Washington. So going back to my first question, would we have been a country without George Washington? Or is there a chance his military maneuvers and his willingness to step down, those two things, and maybe there was more important things Washington did, but is there something, if he wanted to have been there, could we have had an entirely different country?
It's almost impossible to imagine the United States existing without George Washington.
Wow.
There's simply too many times when his personal role in what was unfolding was the thing that made it work.
One man. You're saying our whole 330 million people, 245 years later, is kind of dependent on one man being born.
Well, again, I would say necessary but not sufficient.
Uh-huh.
I wouldn't say dependent upon, but there were certain points in the drama where if it had been somebody else, and also this was recognized by his peers. I mean, that's why he was who he was. Right. He wasn't the smartest. He wasn't a great military genius. He wasn't the funniest, the most charming. He wasn't the best wordsmith. He wasn't the only thing that he was the best at was having high public character that was recognized by everyone else, no matter what their political affiliations or feelings about the revolution. He was the one guy who almost everybody trusted within the revolution.
Wow.
And did not doubt his public character. But that's why you always come down to the big three in terms of presidents, is because they all fall into this category of it's hard to imagine somebody else's leadership being sufficient.
So I'm going to guess wrong, but keep your thought again.
Okay.
Washington, Lincoln, and Reagan.
Wrong. Yeah, wrong. Yeah.
Okay. We're the big three for folks that don't know.
Washington, Lincoln, and FDR.
Okay. Okay. So do we want to, well, you keep going, or I'm going to keep interrupting, whatever your preference is.
You can interrupt.
So let's go from
Washington, Lincoln, or FDR if you want.
Washington is just absolutely essential. And I didn't know he was that essential. So that's a really interesting topic from today. So thanks for that. I'm going to have to think more on that. Do we have to go all?
Here's why. You just can't imagine that we would have declared independence. That we would have had an army. We know that the army would not have held together at least two different points. The ratification of the Constitution, and then the establishment of the federal government. And you just say, like, you can maybe quibble and say I'm wrong about one of these things, but I'm not wrong about all five. Like there's you just cannot imagine any of these things. I mean, he was the necessary guy.
Fascinating.
In so many.
And as far as presidents go, there was only two others that equal, or not even equal, but are at least on that plane.
Yeah, and I think that really only Lincoln comes close to making a case for being as important.
and Lincoln, again, I'm sorry to be so naive, is probably the most accurate word. So we knew what happened with Dred Scott, and we knew what happened in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There was a true cultural desire in the South and a true cultural disgust in the North. And out of that came a Lincoln. But if Lincoln wasn't born, wouldn't there have been somebody else? Or no, it actually, history does depend on individuals.
Well, it's hard to imagine because of his potential rivals. He was the one person who stayed the most focused on the correct story of America. and the whole United States and the whole federal story. Whereas some of his potential rivals tended to be people who had maybe narrower views of the American story. So in other words, Lincoln did really strive to understand how the South was a part of the United States at the time of the founding.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an undeniable fact.
Yeah.
And really what the founders founded was one country. And holding true to that, despite the political pressures, it's just very difficult to imagine any of his potential rivals holding true to that vision when there were so much, when it would have been so much easier to do something else.
So in modern context, what you're just describing as a virtue is often described as a vice or a character flaw.
Right.
That they're taking contemporary times and going, that's just, I mean, he was willing to allow slavery to continue if it kept the Union together. Well, that's just evil in contemporary language, right? It seems like almost everybody agrees with that that's evil. But you're saying that, but we wouldn't even be a country, and he realized that, and how to form the all men are created equal, the Declaration, how to, our human's highest calling wouldn't have even happened if it wasn't for the country, and then he was trying to keep the country. I know I'm being it in layman's terms, but
yeah, and I think but the more important thing is what happens to a country if what happens to representative government if you set the precedent that if one group of people becomes inconvenient and doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of your government, that you cut them off and let them go. Because you don't like them and because they don't like you. Because the important thing that is preserved is the idea that the winners and the losers of an election must acknowledge the results of the election. And if you don't do that, your country will fall apart, and it won't take long.
So there's an allusion to former President Trump there, but there's also an allusion to the constant din, I would say, I think that's probably accurate, of people to say, Texas should just secede, let them go, or California should, let them go. Right. It's across the spectrum, people go, those jerks, we hate them, let them go, or we...
Yeah, I mean, slavery and the legacy of racism in the American South, it would have been much easier once the United States was established. The American South was 2/3 of the national economy at the time of our founding, and they were 1/3 of the national economy by the time of the Civil War. And if we had simply cut them off and let them form a separate country, they would have been a backwards third world republic. And the United States might have been much more prosperous without that anchor around our necks. But we would, because freedom works a lot better than slavery and racism.
Right.
And in the case of, but what also might have happened in the North is you might have just seen rebellion after rebellion, or as Sherman said, eternal war. And in that letter to the people of Atlanta, Sherman says, if you do not acknowledge this, we will soon reap the fate of Mexico, which is eternal war. Right? They were well aware of what you must accept national authority here. And if you don't, we're going to end up like every other failed republic in the world. I mean, if you were alive in 1860 and you had witnessed, and I don't remember, I'm trying to, off the top of my head, 14, 15 different republics that had been founded in the 1820s and 30s that were all failing within 10 years. I mean, you could look around the world and see that there was a very clear model of how to make a republic fail. There were 15 of them in the Western Hemisphere. So it wasn't hard for people at the time, and it is what they were thinking of. I guess maybe this is gone from the modern mind, but it's in their letters and it's in their speeches that they were looking at what was going on in in Mexico, Central America, Latin America, and saying, this is what's going to happen to us if we let the South go. We're going to have eternal war and unstable governments.
Fascinating. I've got a couple of not research, that's too melodramatic, but reading assignments for myself. Okay, cool. I don't want to go to FDR yet. We might get back to him later. I'm trying to think of modern personalities that seem to drive history. So we probably want to be in the war in the Middle East without Dick Cheney. Agreed? Isn't it one man, or is there a whole societal thing that we had to do that?
That's certainly not where my mind goes. I think more along the lines of Eisenhower and the two George Bushes.
Okay, keep going.
In Eisenhower, in the case of who could keep the Western alliance together and mold it into a fighting force, and then who could have managed to really create in America what we would consider normal that was really abnormal, and set us on a pretty good path post World War II. And then in the case of the first George Bush, it's almost impossible to imagine Germany united, the title of the book by Condoleezza Rice, Germany United and a World Transformed. It's almost impossible to imagine any other president of the United States being able to manage the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So keep going again, because that's not a new concept to me, but that doesn't resonate to me as true. So explain.
When you look at the decisions that he was making and how quickly he was making them in terms of managing the diplomacy of all of Eastern Europe and all of the new republics that were popping up out of the Soviet Union, along with the collapse of the Soviet Union and
this
all
is
the
President 41.
All of the issues around the resolution of the Cold War. I can't even think of another American who would have been able to do what he did.
But he was also surrounded by the military industrial national security apparatus. I mean, that was his background, right? I mean,
he was surrounded by good people because he had always surrounded himself with good people. But that is also
but they weren't local people. I mean, they weren't like neighborhood community activist people. They were at the highest levels of national security people.
Yes, but part of what he was able to do was, the ultimate in local politics. He would pick up the phone and call people, and he could do it because he knew them. And in many of these cases, it was his personal credibility where he would say, listen, we're doing this, and I know you and you know me, and I will, I will keep my word. And this is, if I say this is what's going to happen, it's what's going to happen. And the next thing you know, you have Germany. I mean, if you like, it's almost it's just if you had told somebody that Germany is going to be a country again,
right?
It's just, that's what I mean. It falls under that category of being almost impossible to imagine anyone else being able to do that without it spinning out of control.
So you've come down 3 times so far, and we're going to go through a couple more if you don't mind before you have to head off to your students. But Washington, Lincoln, and now President 41, the first George Bush. No, it needed that person. The people, an individual makes history, not the culture around the individual. Or somebody else, if they would have been assassinated, would have stepped up and done the same thing that George Washington, Abe Lincoln, or George Bush did. It requires individual changing history.
Yeah, of course. There's always every individual has a duty to their times, and as Theodore Roosevelt said, to do your duty in the old-fashioned way as it arises each morning. You can't pawn that off on somebody else.
Fascinating. So let me go back to the beginning again. Rosa Parks, there would have been somebody else, or no, it kind of required her. I mean, she happened to have the right amount of courage and the right kind of setting to set off everything that allowed Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, I mean, the easier answer would be Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks was certainly important. I don't know.
But in that instance, you're saying somebody else might have done the bus, or there might have been something else that triggered it.
I'm just going to punt and say you need to talk to one of my colleagues who knows specifically who was in the civil rights movement at the time.
Some expert, not your expertise.
Yeah.
Okay. But you do know enough about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and you've already said that he is a person who changed history.
Almost impossible to imagine someone else being as effective as he was.
Okay. Give a couple more lines. You did that on Washington and Lincoln. Give a couple lines why he was so important versus some other reverend or some other actor.
Because he was, well, I guess if I were to rank these things in matter of importance, you'd say because he had the intellectual background to formulate a philosophy of protest that would be specifically appealing in American history and politics.
But does that mean? But do you mean like he had the ability to put words together, like was it the letter from Birmingham jail? I can't remember he was able to articulate, take all these thoughts and put it into a cohesive message.
Well, I would say, that's where I was going next. Is not first you have to know it, but so I always you can't just be a good speaker. You have to have. So the first thing he had to have the knowledge, and then he had to have the character to be committed to this. Because the other thing is that there are within almost any movement, there are sometimes people who have other motives besides actually solving the problem. He actually wanted to solve the problem and was willing to sacrifice in order to do that. So you have to have the knowledge, you have to have the character, and then you have to have the ability, right? Which is, he had not just the rhetorical ability, but also the organizational ability to hold the movement together. So again, there's a reason why he's one of the biggies, right? Because it's almost impossible to imagine anyone else who had the knowledge, the background, the character applied to that knowledge and background, and then the ability to execute it. And I think is evidenced by the fact that nobody else could do it. I mean, there were no other, there was no other, meaningful second place person, and in that sense, you would have to say he is kind of like a Washington, where there were a few moments where you would say to yourself, if it wasn't for this person, it's just not happening.
Okay, so we've got two presidents and a third. You mentioned FDR and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Are there other folks that have changed society in substantive ways that wouldn't have happened? And I'm thinking whether it's but in U.S. history, just rattle off some. And is it an Einstein? Is it a Muhammad Ali? What kind of fields and expertise that if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have boxing as it is, or baseball as it is, or music, or
in every field of human endeavor, there is an example of you can find examples of the people who were necessary. Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, I would say Alexander Hamilton is probably, was never president, but I mean, it could be, I don't know, in the field of, in every field of human inquiry, there are people who make breakthroughs, and some of these breakthroughs you can say, oh, well, we would have gotten there eventually. But some of them are so innovative that it's hard to imagine anyone else putting it together that way.
So you have an undergraduate, master's, and a PhD in U.S. history.
Yep.
And you can revise and extend and edit your remarks later. But you can, because we'll have another show on them or something. But just kind of take a thought train for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes and just name some that are worthy of books or movies or poems being made about them. I mean, in the old days, we used to create songs about them, so who are the folks that if somebody wanted to understand U.S. history, U.S. culture, who we are, why we are, and what we should be doing in today's culture, who should we emulate? Who should we think about? What are some, I don't know whether it's 5 or 10 or 50. I mean, just rattle off some different books, movies, poems, songs, that you think we should be concentrating more on versus, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this, Professor. We argue about the crappiest things right now. I'm beside myself every day and have been for years about why we're arguing about some weird abnormality of some human being or what some stupid statement one of us makes. And so we all rip down that throat of the person who made the stupid statement. And maybe it's a trend and maybe it's newsworthy eventually, but we just have gone overboard and arguing about silly stuff. Rather, it seems like there's some really important issues going on. It seems like we should be ripe for a leader that gets us back on track. So that's the point of this show is how does a historian help us get back on track on arguing about meaningful things rather than the trite, the silly, the weird?
I mean, I think the place to probably start is just with the Oxford History of the American People. If you just want to become an informed citizen and you don't know where to start, just start reading those books. They're fantastic. Most of them are the best book on the subject. But that's where I would begin, not necessarily with any particular figures, but I can certainly tell you my own, personal observations of things that I consider to be underappreciated after you learn the basics. And so, learn the basics, pick up your, Robert Middlecoff, The Glorious Cause, and Gordon Wood, and then your Kennedy, and I can't remember all of who did every edition, but they're pretty darn good, all of them. But I can tell you, the figures that I think are woefully understudied in terms of their importance, probably still Alexander Hamilton, believe it or not.
Even with the play.
Because studying the life of Hamilton is such an important window into so many different aspects of America, that he really is this figure that allows you to study so many different areas of the founding through his life. It still is a pretty extraordinary journey. So I'd say go deeper than the musical, and then I think that studying Frederick Douglass's entire life, people tend to use, one of the things that people do with Frederick Douglass a lot is they select things at different points of his life and say, this is what Frederick Douglass thought.
Across the spectrum, each side or all sides. Too.
Yeah. So what everybody does is they'll pull something out of context and say, this is what Frederick Douglass thought. But I think that one of the most important things you can do is to follow Frederick Douglass's life and study his thought at every point in his life, because it's the evolution of someone who is thinking about matters of liberty at the most fundamental level for his entire life, who is in touch with the political currents of the day.
Would you put him in the top 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 most important people in U.S. history? 50? I mean, where? I mean, I know I'm not trying to pin you down, but is he really influential?
Because to me, I would put him in the top 15 most important observers of American liberty.
Okay.
In terms of being one of the most important thinkers about the nature of American liberty. And the one that I pull, who I would also put in this category, is James Weldon Johnson, who is woefully understudied, because if people are quoting Frederick Douglass out of context, they don't even quote James Weldon Johnson anymore, let alone, quote him out of context. And I would put him in the same category. He's just woefully understudied. He might be the most underappreciated, understudied figure in American political thought. So, I mean, there's just not enough good study of him, his life, his work. I mean, there should be 10 biographies of him. There should be volumes and volumes. There's a 2-volume set of his writings, an edited collection. It's 2 volumes, but there should be
not enough context, though.
But the problem with somebody like James Weldon Johnson is that usually figures from the past become famous because they are useful to somebody's contemporary political agenda. And James Weldon Johnson doesn't serve anybody's political purposes today. He's an inconvenient figure for everybody.
Okay, that's really intriguing. Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. Who else?
In terms of just political thinkers who I think are under.
Yeah, or philosophy, or somebody who just changed everything.
Well, I would say the next person who probably deserves more attention, and he's getting some, is probably Calvin Coolidge. Mm-hmm. I like people who define what normal is. I don't know if you can tell that this is my sort of my big idea. The thing I care about the most is what is it that creates peace and human thriving? Mm-hmm. And I believe that one of the things that creates peace and human thriving is, as you started off with, your initial question is like the stories we tell ourselves. And a big part of the story we tell ourselves involves, what do we think normal is? So I like studying people who are contributing to the story we tell ourselves about what normal is. And that's why I like to study people like James Weldon Johnson, Calvin Coolidge, Dwight Eisenhower, the first George Bush. These are all figures who, I probably shouldn't have included the first George Bush in that story, but I really think that Eisenhower and Coolidge are way more important than people give them credit for, because establishing normal is really important.
Okay, so let me not push back, but let me probe just a little bit on that. There was a quote that I'm botching, and I saw it on Facebook, so it's probably not even true. I think this one is, but I'm not sure. It said, "Hey, what's the most defining?" I think she asked it of the female anthropologist, the woman. Oh gosh, what is her name? I think she studied. Well, she said, "What's the most defining thing in the history of the human race?" And it was when she discovered a broken leg, and that's civilization, because they must have carried this person. They must have healed the person with the broken leg is worthless, so they just leave him for the wolves or whatever. Mm-hmm. Who is that? It wasn't Margaret Mead. Maybe it was Margaret Mead. Does that quote ring a bell to you? Not
really, but it sounds like.
The point is interesting. Yeah. Is it the person, or is it this undefined cultural norm? Or in de Tocqueville, understanding America. He didn't like. Well, you're the historian, I'm the layman, but it's just like describing these autonomous or self-organizing volunteer groups of Americans changing things and fixing things was unique. They thought it was just fascinating that people just self-organized to solve problems. And so those aren't the people, that's culture. And that gets to my point, which is more important, the person or the culture?
Well, the people make the culture. You're presenting me with a false choice. So, and I have my answer. If you were to ask me that same question about the most important defining moment in human history, and I would say it was when England decided to go from God, king, law to God, law, king. But that was something that required a lot of history and culture and development and human beings to change their minds and things like that. But that was the thing that, you know, put all of human history on an entirely different trajectory.
Because everybody had if not called a king, some dictator or some ruler, maybe. Every culture throughout the world, including indigenous populations, had some high priestess, or, there was somebody in charge, right? And they generally were divinely inspired.
But the best idea in the world doesn't matter if nobody believes it and nobody implements it. I mean, this is something that I wrote about a little bit last week. Was the central conservative truth is that the measure of a civilization is its culture. That's a Daniel Patrick Moynihan formulation. It doesn't matter how good your constitution is if it's written in pencil. It doesn't matter how good your constitution is if the people in that country don't follow it. So the best idea in the world in the abstract is worthless. It's only when it becomes connected to human beings and human actions. It's only when people begin to believe the idea that the idea goes into action. So the measure of a society is its culture, meaning that if you want to know if we live in a good country or a bad country, look around. How are people being treated? How are poor people and unpopular minorities
rich people?
But it could be rich people, it could be gay people, it could be whoever happens to be the unpopular minority in any set of circumstances, and you will have your answer based on the culture, looking at how people actually live.
So that's why you don't like my question. It's both. I mean, culture and people change history.
Well, yeah, because it's ultimately how human beings implement ideas by their own lives, or what was it? Theodore Roosevelt said, we need better men, better laws, and better administration of laws, and by far the first is the most important. That's him saying what matters is what we actually do. What matters is the culture. We can have better laws and we can say we want better administration of laws, but if we don't have the actual human beings who believe in better laws and implementing better laws, then it doesn't really matter.
So do you think our constitutional republic is vulnerable right now? And whether it's from external influences or internal decay or political discord, I mean, do you think we're more vulnerable than you would have guessed 10 years ago?
I don't know, but I had an answer, but then you added 10 years ago.
Okay, well,
I think our constitution. How about this? I think our constitutional republic is vulnerable always.
Okay, love that.
Because we're always vulnerable to people not caring about these abstract principles, because it's not the existence of these abstract principles that actually keeps us free. I mean, what keeps my house free from violence is not the fact that it's impossible to break into my house. What keeps my house free from violence is the fact that most people aren't criminals.
Right.
What is it? Lincoln said, "Let not him who is houseless pull down the other, but rather let him endeavor to build his own, so that both shall be free from violence when built." Right. This is another example of what matters is culture. If you have a culture where I build my house and leave you alone, then you build your house and leave me alone, and now we have a culture where both of our houses are free from violence when built. What actually matters is how we live. Do we respect the rights of others?
Yeah, wonderful. I almost want to end with that. Have I given you enough opportunity to kind of lay out your worldview of people and culture? I mean, you haven't written a book, Democracy in America, I think was de Tocqueville's or something, but have I given you enough time to reflect?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, it's funny that this was your topic for this week, because it's something I've been turning over in my head since I had one of these moments last week where, I'd always used this Daniel Patrick Moynihan quotation, and I'd seen it reprinted in a lot of different places, but I decided to track down the original source for it just to see, what was the context of this quotation. And what I found was fascinating to me, because it was a very short memo. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that it was written, essentially the last thing he wrote before he died. I didn't realize that he wrote it within at least weeks of when he died. And I also didn't realize that there was a beginning and an ending to it. And the beginning and the ending parts of it I found just as fascinating, which was that he begins it's only like 5 sentences long, but the first sentence is that he states, "This is the one thing, there's one thing that I have absolutely learned in public life. Like I know that this thing is true." And then he lays out and he says, well, the central conservative truth is that the measure of a civilization is its culture. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save itself. And that's normally where people stop. But that wasn't what his conclusion was. His conclusion was that it's the interaction between these two things that have made America a better place. And that's the thing that he said he has learned. Because, pulling these two things out out of their context makes it seem like he's merely describing these two things that conservatives and liberals believe. That wasn't his point in writing.
Right.
His writing was to tell Americans that it's essentially our pluralistic system that has made America a better place, and that it was really a call to remind ourselves what we benefit from in a pluralistic system where we believe in the same things, we simply emphasize different rights. And that, I think, is a much more profound point than to merely accurately describe what conservatives believe and what liberals believe.
Yeah. That's and you've been consistent on that theme for as long as I've known you. So it's kind of interesting.
I like it, right? He agrees with me.
Yeah, right. But it kind of,
I didn't realize that.
You have a subject matter expert that also endorses your worldview. So it's kind of nice for it to come together for me.
He's an interesting guy, Democratic liberal senator from New York, but also worked with the Nixon administration. And there are very few liberals who spent more time with conservatives. He was a liberal who spent a lot of time with conservatives.
Okay, before we, that's another great way to end. So I'm probably going to blow it here in the next 5 minutes, but that's okay. Shocking. What else is new? Ben, get ready if you have a question. But before we go to Ben, if he has one, I teased you inaccurately in hindsight with a couple names of potential change makers that didn't succeed. And I think I threw out like Ross Perot and maybe McGovern, and I threw out options between the two parties as potential change makers that failed. And I'm wondering, in contemporary terms, I'm trying to, where I spend my time for much of my life and in current politics. I'm asking a historian. I'm just deeply dissatisfied with both political parties right now, but I don't want to be a negative, just a whiner, complainer. I want to do something. I want to make a positive difference in the world. And so I don't want to just say I hate them and I hate them or I hate all of them. And so I'm always looking for alternatives, third parties or people moving along. But to me, it seems like we're stuck in a two-party system for a long time. And I understand they changed Lincoln or the modern Republican Party. It just seems like it's weird. We have all these cereal choices. We have all these car choices. We have housing choices. We have marriage choices. We have there's so many choices in everything today except for politics, and we get two. Here are your two choices. Live with it and just suck up and whatever. And to me, that almost seems irrational. So will you tell me, no, John, you're misunderstanding it. It's important to only have two choices in politics because of something I'm unaware of. Or can you give me some historical context of, do we want to go to a parliamentary system or no, John, be very wary of that? Or talk to me.
Well, ask your question in
a cohesive way. I'll take that insult.
Sorry, I just don't know which part of it you want me to address.
Any of it. Why are we in a mess? And isn't there a better way to deal with this mess politically? In today's political terms, do I have to wait for a leader just to emerge to form a new party that I join? Or is there something citizens can do?
I'll try to do this in reverse order. So what should citizens be doing right now? Citizens right now should be engaged in civic life. So if you are a citizen wondering what to do, go on your city's website and join some committee of some kind. It doesn't matter what it is, just whatever you're interested in, participate in civic life and do your best to make good decisions on behalf of your fellow citizens. That's what an individual citizen can do.
Love that.
As for the political parties, what is it that essentially caused this? Regulation. Like the same thing happens in so many industries. Regulation of any kind, what it really does is it kills competition. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about hardware stores or political parties. The more regulated the institution, the entity is, the more expensive it is to compete with it. And because of the highly, highly regulated political system that we have now, in particular controlling ballot access, I would say if you want a solution, deregulate the political system. But neither Republicans nor Democrats want that to happen. So this is a system that benefits them specifically. And in terms of what was the other question that you asked? But at the same time, those same regulations have weakened political parties' ability to control their own candidates. So we have this sort of worst of both worlds right now, where nobody can have access except for these two political parties. But if you choose to work within them, they are houses of cards. And
they don't have the money and the power to control themselves. It's special interest 527, Citizens United, unlimited amounts of money, who are controlled by this group or that group.
Yeah, and there's nothing that political parties could do to even contain it.
It's illegal for them to try to do something to coordinate with them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's insightful. So, but Professor, I like your individual comment. I think that's delightful. But you inaccurately, this is my hearing you, it's not what you've said. You've described an element of the Republican Party being a heart attack and an element of the Democratic Party of being a cancer. And both are very serious. So in that perspective, that's kind of depressing. And I don't mean to say it's in a depressing way, but there's got to be something else we as leaders, because you and I aren't just average citizens, I hope, we're a little bit better than average. Well, heck, I want to be an average citizen. We're both wearing white t-shirts and we're just people. But I want to help us do something more than just allow a cancer and a heart attack to go on in a greatest experiment in self-control, self-government that the world's ever had. So what can we do in a broader way together with other average citizens?
Well, when we say that, one is a cancer and the other is a heart attack, maybe we need to remind ourselves of another metaphor, and that is that all poison is in the dosage. It's okay to have a few radicals who say wacky things because, that's part of the open debate and citizenship. The problem is you don't put them in charge, and you understand, oh, this is a crazy person, right? But, the world needs crazy people too. And the same goes for the things that are bad ideas that would act as a cancer upon society. They are growths out of good ideas. People caring about justice and wanting to care about equality of condition. That's not a bad instinct that human beings have. It just becomes a cancer when the dosage is too high.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay. And I know you have a hard stop, so I'm kind of intentionally interrupting you. Hey, Ben, do you have a quick question? Or are you happy to defer for today?
I'm happy to defer for today. I'm just enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, he was good today, wasn't he? Yeah, thanks, Ben, for joining us. So, Professor, you get the last word. You have less than 3 minutes, so don't go over 3 minutes. If you were to give us advice on the context of the history of humans in America, who should we read? What should we be doing? Anything that you haven't talked about that you wish I would have asked? This is your chance to give your closing statement for the future of humanity.
Oh, wow.
I know it's not that bold, but at least for this show.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say almost any human being, any American would benefit from reading that Oxford History of the American People. And if you don't want to, read the whole thing, read the section that you know the least about. Go read the one from the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I promise that you will be happy that you did if you actually read the whole thing. And then I'm always excited to give a plug to James Weldon Johnson, because I really do believe he is underappreciated. And if you just want to read a good book, read his novel, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. It's a good book. It's a novel. People read them for fun. It's an easy read. I used to assign it to students and they loved it.
Excellent. And those are 3 things I have not done yet. As you know, I have read many of your suggestions and I'm working my way through them. But I'll move those up the category chart.
Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. Sorry, I'll just one last plug for it. It's easy, it's fast, it's fun. It won't feel like work. You'll start reading it and you'll want to keep reading it until it's finished. It's a good novel, and then maybe you'll want to study more about James Weldon Johnson after you read that novel.
Brilliant.
That's what
happened. Yeah. Well, you've been reading for a profession and avocation for a long time.
Well, I read that book when I was a 19-year-old college student. I wasn't a big fancy person when I took African American literature, and Woody Childs assigned the book, and I thought, I love this guy. I want to know more about James Weldon Johnson.
Awesome. Well, Professor, I can't even do niceties because you said you had a hard stop, and we're about at that hard stop. So hope you have a delightful day. Take care of your students. Ben, thanks for joining us. Maybe we'll see you next week, Professor.
Right on. Take care.
Thank you.